My name is Frieda Afary. I am an Iranian American librarian in Los Angeles. I'm also a translator and writer, and have had the honor of offering this series that started 2 weeks ago. This is the third session. I think most of you have come to earlier sessions, but in case you haven't, and this is your first one, welcome. So today we will discuss the idea of how to become a critical humanist thinker, writer, activist. The first part of the presentation is will offer you some ideas on precisely this concept of becoming a critical humanist thinker, writer, activist. Discuss some questions related to the presentation. And then we will move on to the second part of the class, which will be based on the idea of an activity that would be related to this topic of becoming a critical humanist thinker. Began this class series by defining humanism as the idea that humans can come together around universal concepts and use their potential for reasoning to solve problems. I would argue that the most basic requirement for humanism is for humans to have shared meaning and shared knowledge. And that is not possible with a public that does not read and does not read deeply. What we're faced with in the US today is a society that's bombarded with disinformation, misinformation, and views that promote hatred and extremism. And when it comes to figures on reading, they are dismal. Only 1/3 of children in 3rd grade read at grade level, read at the proficient level. That's based on not only the Nation's report card that I cite here, 2022, but the latest one that came out just a month ago or 2 months ago. Among adults, roughly half only read at 6th grade level and not beyond. So for the world's richest country that is the most technologically advanced, these figures are truly dismal. And then, of course, everyone is familiar with the problem of addiction to social media. Some of you might have read Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, which has been on the bestseller list for months, which argues that with the rise of smartphones and the addiction to smartphones, young people especially, but people in general have become distracted, depressed, sleep deprived, and socially deprived. So we are facing a society that's in crisis. The work of Maryanne that I respect a lot, that I will discuss further today, addresses this crisis. And specifically in her book, Reader Come Home, which was published in 2018, she argues that over-reliance on digital reading has created fissures in our cognitive and emotional abilities and has made us prone to extremism and hatred. So what does she mean by that? She means that when we read online all the time, we don't even realize that we're reading too fast. We're not paying attention. We're skimming more and more. We are not really thinking through. We are not reflecting on what we are reading. We're becoming more and more passive in taking in the information, and even the information that's taken in is taken in partially. And so that is actually changing our brains. It is creating fissures or holes in our cognitive and emotional abilities. And it is making us unreflective. It is making us thoughtless. And that is why it's that this over-reliance on digital reading is making us prone to extremism and hatred. She argues that the antidote to that is deep reading, which is also related to critical thinking and empathy. So let's explore that further. So what are the steps involved in deep reading? First, Wolf wants us to recognize that the speed required for reading online and the speed required for reading a printed book are different. When we read online, we automatically speed up, and that takes away from reflection, from thinking through in a way that we don't even think about it. When we read a printed book, we slow down automatically. She wants us to read highly meaningful books in print. She's asking us to go back to reading the classics, but not only the classics, but also works, current works that are really serious, that are thoughtful, that require engaging with the text and require thinking things through and paying attention. She wants us to read word by word and not skim. Of course, that is not true, but that's not possible for everything. Of course, she recognizes that there's some things that we would have to skim, especially when we read online. But she's asking us to take the time to pick some texts that are really serious and read them carefully and think through them. And you cannot read something carefully if you don't read it word by word. So the steps involved in deep reading are, first, that we pay attention and we have the ability to concentrate. So it's just from the get-go, it's very difficult to do that in this world because we're constantly distracted, especially if we have our cell phone on us and keeps beeping. So we have to deliberately find ways to increase our attention level and increase our concentration and not be constantly distracted as much as is possible. Deep reading requires that we remember what we've read, either by taking notes or even marginal notes if a book belongs to you and it's not a library book. And if that's not possible, there should still be a way for you to review, just stop, review, make sure you remember what you read and move on. She wants us to follow the sequence of the text or the narrative. So read actively, pay attention to the sequence. How do we go from this paragraph to the next paragraph? How do we go from this chapter to the next chapter? Draw connections between the observations and questions gleaned. So again, it's the idea of reading actively. You're making observations, you're asking questions. Put yourself in the position of the author and the characters. Follow the logic of the author's argument or plot. This is extremely important. Whether you're reading work of fiction or nonfiction, but especially a work of nonfiction, the author has worked so hard to present something. Many books are the products of years and years of work. And so it's very important to take the time to think about the logic of the author's argument. Whether one agrees with it or not, one has to understand the logic of this author's argument. And Wolf thinks that if we do that, we can be transformed. She has this beautiful passage in her book that I'm going to quote right now, which shows the connection between deep reading and empathy. She says, We welcome the other as a guest within ourselves, and sometimes we become other. For a moment in time, we leave ourselves, and when we return, sometimes expanded and strengthened, we are changed both intellectually and emotionally. Again, it's the idea of being an active reader, really taking in what you've read, thinking through it, and letting it transform you, letting it arouse your critical capacities, letting it ask you questions. Um, it's something that you have to open yourself up to, but it requires all the other steps that I mentioned that are part of the process of deep reading. Okay, so how is deep reading related to critical thinking? Wolf argues that in order for us to be deep readers, we need to approach the text both with internalized background knowledge and conceptual frameworks. Most often we take that for granted. In order to really engage a text, you need to have some background knowledge. You need to have some conceptual frameworks in order to ask questions, in order to be an active reader. And she argues that these conceptual frameworks need to be flexible enough to be open to new ideas, changes, expansion, and enrichment. And if they're not, then they hinder the process of deep reading. In fact, she says in her book that it's very difficult to be a deep reader if your conceptual frameworks are completely rigid. For instance, if you're a religious fundamentalist and you believe that the Bible is the sole truth, then that is an example of a very rigid conceptual framework. But at the same time, she says, if you have no conceptual framework, that's also going to make it very, very difficult to be a deep reader. You have to have a conceptual framework. And it's different for different age groups. For instance, I was talking to the librarians about this idea last week, and how for children, for example, how do you teach children conceptual frameworks? I mean, the idea of friendship, the idea of kindness, the idea of solidarity, the idea of honesty. Okay, you have to have stories that explain these concepts to children so that they can then, in turn, have those conceptual frameworks in their minds when they approach other people or they read other books. So it's not, when we say conceptual framework, it means something different for various age groups. And of course, when people get older, the conceptual frameworks become more sophisticated. For adults, for instance, with the librarians, I was suggesting that they discuss courses from the teaching company in libraries, courses that discuss the ideas of various philosophers. For teens, there are books that discuss concepts that would be directly related to the teen experience, that also include, in addition to, of course, concepts like friendship, honesty, generosity, they also include concepts like gender, concepts like critical race theory. These are all conceptual frameworks. So once you have the background knowledge and some conceptual frameworks, you're much more capable of being a deep reader. And then you can use the background knowledge and the conceptual framework to draw meaning from what you're reading, to make inferences, to analyze, to evaluate the writer's assumptions, ideas, conclusions, and most importantly, to reflect on the whole process in order to arrive at new insights and thoughts. And she emphasizes this quite a bit, that active reading means that you at some point get to develop your own ideas. It's not just that you're taking things in, but this process of taking things in has to at some point lead to your being able to develop new ideas. But the way to do that requires the what she calls cognitive patience of going through this process of deep reading. It's only then, and then when you reflect on the process as a whole, it's only then that she says, you can come up with new insights and thoughts. Okay, so how have some other humanist thinkers discussed this issue of critical thinking? There was so much that I could say about it. I started writing notes about, philosophy from Plato to the British, to Descartes and British empiricists, and on to Kant and Hegel. And I thought, for this class, I'm just going to stick to some issues from Kant and Hegel. So Kant was also arguing that in order for us to make sense out of our experiences, we need categories, concepts, or what Wolff calls conceptual frameworks. He said that representations, or to use the word intuition, but what he really meant was representations. Representations without concepts are blind. Concepts without representations are empty. So you need concepts, you need categories, you need the conceptual framework to make sense of your experience. Otherwise, how can you make sense out of your experience if you just experience something without having a framework, a concept to be able to describe it, to be able to analyze it? At the same time, Kant thought that human understanding can only be partial, created a table of 12 categories that he thought were a priori, or prior to experience, that he thought were applicable to all sense experiences. And examples of this are categories like universality, causality, necessity. He was saying these are the 12 categories that we have as humans prior to experience that can help us give meaning to our experience, or structure our experience, make sense of our experience. Now, a philosopher, Hegel, he argued, he tried to build on Kant's work, but he argued that those concepts or categories need to be derived from experience, and they also need to be developed further in light of experience. Kant's categories were fixed, but Hegel's argument was that in order for us to make sense out of our experiences, our categories themselves need to develop in the process. So it's not as if you employ a category to understand an experience and the category remains the same. No, the conceptual framework also has to change, which is similar really to what Wolff is saying about how in order to do deep reading, we need conceptual frameworks that are not rigid, that are capable of absorbing new experiences and new concepts. So for Hegel, critical thinking is, unlike Kant, who says that we can only have a partial view of something. For Hegel, critical thinking is about grasping the whole of a process of something, but in its movement. So he says that nothing is fixed, nothing is just static. Everything that you are exploring is moving, it has internal contradictions, it has possibilities for forward movement or retrogression. So when you employ conceptual framework or concepts or categories to make sense out of your experience, or to understand an object, a process, you are trying to understand what it is in its movement. Otherwise, he argues that you really cannot be practicing critical thinking. And it's that grasping of the whole process or work in its movement that he argues is the pathway to developing new ideas and new categories. And again, this is similar to what Wolf was saying about how deep reading requires that you explore the whole process, and through that process of exploration of the whole, you come up with new insights and new ideas. Okay. So now, in order to understand this further, I thought it would be helpful to compare what we've discussed as critical humanist thinking to AI thinking or machine thinking. So machine thinking in AI is the idea that large masses of information are taken by this AI capacity, and patterns are found in masses of information. These patterns are found without distinguishing between fact and disinformation or bias. Generative artificial intelligence finds patterns in masses of information. Predictive artificial intelligence makes predictions about the future on the basis of the patterns found. So it's not really in any way what we've been discussing. It is entirely different from the concept of critical humanist thinking. In critical humanist thinking, we approach experiences with conceptual frameworks and background knowledge that are both solid and open to further development. We attempt to grasp the whole of a process in its movement with its internal contradictions and possibilities for forward movement or retrogression. Through this engagement, we become transformed. We, the reader or the explorer, we become more enriched. We can develop new ideas and categories. And we become more empathetic toward other human beings and toward nature. That is not at all what is taking place with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is, as one author described, is like a calculator. You just give it masses of information and it makes calculations. It's based on applying formulas or algorithms to huge masses of information. So this is an entirely different way of quote unquote thinking. This is not critical thinking. It's not critical humanist thinking. Okay, so now I would like to just offer you some questions based on what I've described, and hopefully for those of you who have had a chance to read the chapter in Maryanne Wolf's book, I would like to go over some questions that are related to what I just presented, and maybe some of the concepts that are further discussed in Wolf, and see what you think. And then after we've had a bit of time to discuss these questions and your own further comments, then we'll go to the second part of this class, which is about the idea of bringing that critical humanist thinking capacity to bear on a topic that's a burning issue of the day. And the topic that I've chosen is the issue of mass deportation, the assault on immigrants, how to combat anti-immigrant hatred,